Okay, good evening. My name's Tracy Craig. I'll be moderating tonight's meeting. I think I know quite a few of you. It's good to see you. And for those of you that are new, would you raise your hand just so we know who's new to this event? Okay, we're glad you're here. Thank you. This is our 13th community meeting in 7 years, so we've had quite a few. This is our community-wide meeting to provide an update on environmental investigations, mitigation, and remediation for impacts to the environment from the former Ford Aeronutronics facility that operated in Newport Beach way back in the day before this was all developed. So thank you for coming. We've also had quite a few other meetings with individual homeowners, HOAs and such, so probably all told, wow, I'd say probably something like 40 meetings? Yeah, we've had a lot. So, but tonight's meeting is really just to provide an update on what we're doing and what we've done and what we'll be doing in the upcoming year. A couple housekeeping things first of all. So when you came in, we're hoping that you signed in. You do not have to sign in to participate in this meeting, but if you do sign in, we'll add you to our email update list, and we'll make sure that you get advance notice of meetings. We also let people know through the HOAs, and we have quite a robust mailing list for this project. You also should have gotten quite a few handouts. They look like this. If you didn't get those and you want them, please just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll have somebody run those over to you. Anybody need them? Okay, no. Restrooms are over here and out the door and then outside if anybody needs to use the facilities during the meeting. Okay. This meeting is being live streamed. We're live streaming this because as part of, I think it was after COVID, a lot of people didn't want to come to meetings in person, so we opted to have the live stream option for people that want to attend. And we actually usually have a fairly good attendance from people that are just coming in virtually. To that end, we got a couple complaints last time from people that attended because they couldn't understand the questions that we have, and I think everybody knows our format. We have a short agenda, we go through a presentation, and then we have questions and answers. And so we got some questions. People on the live stream couldn't hear the questions a lot of times because it's hard for them to pick it up, the mic back there. So to that end, if you have questions, we'd like you to write them out again tonight. We're going to go back to that format. If you really feel strongly that you want to ask your question in person, I'm going to be pretty firm about this. I will come over with the microphone, and we're going to make sure that you speak very clearly into the microphone so that our virtual audience can participate to the greatest degree possible. Back to the, so if you want to just write a question here, though, you can write the question, raise your hand, Sarah will run and get the card. I will read it out very clearly, and then we'll answer it. And then, once again, property-specific questions. I think everybody knows about this. This meeting is very general to talk about what we've been doing. If you have a property-specific question, we always save time after the meeting. We have the boards over here that we can go and identify where your property is. We have a lot of people. We have somebody from the Water Board. We have people from WSP, the environmental consultants, and we can discuss individual specific property questions with you there. If you're online and you have property questions, please feel free to put your name and number in the chat box, and WSP will call you tomorrow to discuss any kind of concerns or questions you may have specific to your property. All right, I think that is all our housekeeping at this point. Okay, so this is our agenda. Again, we have a short presentation. I think it's probably about 25 minutes? Yeah, about 25 minutes. I would like everybody to save their questions till the end of the presentation, unless it's a clarifying question, and then go ahead and raise your hand. And again, I'll bring over a microphone and have you ask it very clearly. But usually we find that most of the questions people have are actually answered during the presentation, so it just makes things flow a bit more smoothly if you hold those questions. So there's our agenda. Project update, upcoming work activities, followed, of course, by the question and answer session. And then I would like to introduce who's here tonight. So we have Jessica Law. I think everybody knows Jessica. She's been the project manager from the very beginning. We have Amanda Palumbo. She's a toxicologist with, I'm going to say it right this time, the Office of Environmental Health, Hazard, and Assessment. Took me 13 tries. And then we have Mike Barnes, who's the program manager for WSP. WSP is Ford's environmental consultant, and Mike has been leading this project for the last 7 years. I think he had a short break for a year, but he's back leading this. We also have various WSP staff here. I think most of you know Heidi in the back. She's the one that can answer property-specific questions. I'd also like to encourage people, if you haven't had your indoor air tested and you're within the study areas, please see Heidi and she will sign you up to get that done. That's data that the Water Board really would like to get. So if you haven't had it done, we encourage you to participate in that. It's entirely free and it provides good information. And finally, I just want to note we have Ken Connor over here in the corner. He leads the California operations for WSP, and he has been at all these meetings as well. It's an important project for the company and for Ford. All right. And I think I went through most of this, but I'll do it one more time. You can read that yourself. I just want to make sure everybody got their handouts. It's good information to refer to. And then we've already done the introductions, but just again, this is a Water Board-led site. The Water Board is the regulatory agency providing oversight, a division of the California Environmental Protection Agency. Ford is the responsible party. That means that they're paying for all of the work out here being done. WSP is the environmental consultant that Ford has selected, and Amanda is here to answer questions pertaining to human health regarding contamination. That's it. I hand it over to you.
All right. So I always tend to start off and let y'all know, because I move when I talk. Those that have been here know this. If I get too far away from the microphone and you're having a hard time hearing me, just give me the thumbs up. I know, right? Perry will let me know. I know. I know, but it's so... Okay. All right, so I'm going to lean in a little more. But again, I tend to move, so please, if you can't hear me, thumbs up. I'm going to know to speak closer. So tonight's presentation, for those that have been to past meetings, you guys know the project recap and the vapor intrusion overview, but these are really important, kind of the foundation of the work we're doing and where we're at. So I do like to start off with that for any newcomers and just to give that refresh. But then we're gonna jump into addressing the contamination, what's being done, give a remediation progress update, talk about those next steps, and then just provide a general summary before we jump into the Q&A session. So we'll start off really quick, just kind of how we got here. I'll orient y'all. Get a pointer. All right, so we see this green outline. At the north, that's Bison Road. To the east, that's MacArthur Boulevard. On the south end, that's Ford Road. And then to the west, that's Jamboree. That green outline, that's the 200 acres that Ford had originally leased. Within that 200 acres is this blue outlined area. That's where the facility operated from 1957 until 1993 when it closed. Once it closed, there were cleanup activities that occurred for about 3 years. And in 1996, based on information that was provided by Ford, the Water Board determined that cleanup of that main area was complete, and the local oversight program, which was the regulatory agency at the time, provided soil closure in 1997. That soil closure is what allowed the property to be rezoned from industrial use to residential use. And redevelopment began in 1998, and that's now the One Ford Road community. Part of that soil closure, though, did require the need for continued off-site groundwater assessment and remediation. So then, in addition to that groundwater assessment, in 2006, 2008, and 2012, there were some limited soil gas assessments that were conducted in select areas, and the conclusions from that was that health risks from vapor intrusion were not present. Now, these conclusions were made prior, without any of the indoor air samples being collected, and it was based on just industry knowledge of vapor intrusion at the time. Those conclusions were also made prior to that 2014 US EPA memo regarding the short-term exposure risk to a chemical called TCE, or trichloroethene, which is one of the site's contaminants of concern. And that was also prior to the 2016 San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board's environmental screening levels that we utilize. So in 2017, the Water Board asked Ford to prepare a conceptual site model report. And a conceptual site model, we refer to it as a CSM, but that's just a report that looks at all of the site history, all of the data that's been collected, and it compares it to the current screening levels and industry standards, and it identifies any potential data gaps that should be investigated some more. So one of the data gaps that had been identified in this conceptual site model was the need to reevaluate the site for potential vapor intrusion. And that was because of the current groundwater concentrations as well as those historical soil gas concentrations. So then in 2018, that's when this vapor intrusion assessment began. And so real quick, a quick refresher on what vapor intrusion is. That is just simply the migration of chemicals in the vapor phase into a building. Now, there's a lot of other definitions on this slide. I'm not going to go through them, but they're here for your reference. But it's important to note that in order for there to be a potential for vapor intrusion, there must first be soil gas contaminated with a vapor-forming chemical, such as a volatile organic compound, or we refer to it as VOCs. Now, for the site, I mentioned on the last slide, one of the site's contaminants of concern is TCE, that trichloroethene. Another one is PCE, that's tetrachloroethene. And these are in that family of volatile organic compounds, or the VOCs. So soil gas, and we refer to it also as soil vapor, that is found in the soil's air spaces. And this little inlay here kind of shows how these soil particles have little gaps in between them, kind of like the air space in a sponge. I've used that example in the past, but it kind of helps to visualize how that vapor can reside below the ground. So that soil gas, it originates from some source of that vapor-forming chemical. So this can be soil contamination or dissolved contamination in groundwater that's off-gassing. And that contamination can move in that vapor phase below the ground surface, as shown by these red arrows. So as the soil gas moves below the ground, it can enter a building through either cracks in the foundation or utilities that enter. Now, typically, normal ventilation can flush these chemicals out so that it doesn't cause a problem. But if they do collect in a home and there's not enough ventilation to flush it out, it may collect at concentrations that can pose a risk to human health. And it's also important to mention that we can have both outdoor and indoor air sources of contamination. So outdoor, you can have bad air pollution that gets into a home. And then inside, things like cleaning products, fragrance, so air fresheners, scented candles. We've seen it with, there's a study on Christmas ornaments that were releasing particular chemicals in indoor air. So that's another source, which is why we are looking at everything, below the ground, indoor air, and outdoor air, to evaluate potential vapor intrusion. And so one of the kind of just general takeaways that I want to make sure everyone knows is that vapor behavior is inherently complex and dynamic. And in general, the closer we get to a building's foundation and ground surface, the more variability is observed. And so these variations can occur because of both natural and man-made factors. So some of those natural factors would be temperature, atmospheric pressure, wind, precipitation, climate, soil type, and soil moisture. And some of the examples of those man-made factors can be the HVAC operation, so how that heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system is used, because that can cause pressure differences between the building and below the ground. And then heating can also cause a stack effect, which is shown in this illustration on the right, where as that hot air rises in a building, it can draw subsurface vapors into a building. And then lastly, the building condition. So what's the type of foundation and what's the condition of that foundation? These different things can hinder or enhance vapor migration. And so that's why we will always say 1 round of indoor air sampling isn't enough. We need at least 2 to say there is no risk. And in other cases, we also want that longer term indoor air monitoring as well. So now we're going to do a quick recap on these environmental screening levels, because this is an important part of establishing just our path forward. And it is a major tool that we have really utilized for the site when we're comparing all the site data that's been collected. So I've talked in the past meetings, it was back in 2019, about the environmental screening levels, but just want to give a quick recap. So they're developed by the San Francisco Bay Water Board. This is the same water board as the Santa Ana Water Board. They just cover the San Francisco region. The environmental screening levels, or ESLs, these are tools that are used to screen or evaluate potential threats posed by contamination at a site. It allows us to prioritize our efforts where the most significant problems have been identified. And it's important to note that a chemical present at a concentration above its corresponding screening level does not mean there's an immediate threat, but it does mean additional evaluation is generally necessary. And the environmental screening levels, they are very stringent, and there are multiple levels of assumptions built in to be protective of both human health and the environment. And these ESLs are updated periodically. Now, something I had mentioned in those 2019 meetings was, we started this investigation in 2018 with the 2016 screening levels. And then in 2019, the screening levels were updated. And the update for the soil gas screening level was that the EPA had their default attenuation factor, which is just a reduction factor of soil gas to indoor air. And that made that screening level a little lower. So I had mentioned this in those meetings back in 2019 about how we were going to keep our path forward the same, utilizing the 2016 ESLs, because all of the work was being done in a phased approach. We were starting in the areas where we had the highest soil gas concentrations detected, and we were working our way out, but the soil vapor plume was being delineated to a non-detect number, so below what the lab could detect it at. But I also mentioned that once we had the data set, we were going to reevaluate that data and see if we needed to expand the indoor air investigation area or not. And so then I want to mention that attenuation factor for that soil gas number that is being utilized in our risk evaluations, which takes me to the next slide. And it's kind of, why am I telling you all of this? It's just so I can refresh your memory all about how we're using the data that's been collected. So since the investigation began in 2018, we've collected a lot of data from soil gas and indoor air, and that has been put into these human health risk assessment reports. The original reports were each submitted per community because of building types and years built. It made sense to have each one done per community and then look at each individual home that had been sampled. Those original reports were submitted back in 2020 and 2021. Now, since that time, folks have either completed the 2 rounds of indoor air sampling or have joined the indoor air sampling, so we've gotten new data. And it's important to evaluate as new data comes available to reevaluate and do another risk assessment. So addendums have been submitted periodically, and those addendums just ensure that the path forward remains protective of human health and the environment. And something that we have said in past meetings is that if we get new information that says, we're going left and we should be course correcting right, we're going to do it. We let all the work that's being done is data driven. And so This is another little risk management chart. I've shown it a bunch of times in the past, but I just have it for reference to remind folks that how we are using the site data and these risk calculations to determine the next steps. So this first section here, this is when we get all of the risk calculations, it kind of gets grouped into one of three categories, looking at both current risk from indoor air and future risk by looking at the soil gas data, and puts it into three priority categories. We're either low priority, a medium priority, or high priority. And then from there, based on where that risk is, that's gonna help determine these potential response actions. And so there's just a list of what those could be. Now, I mentioned on that last slide how that attenuation factor is utilized in our risk assessments. That is for that future risk. Because we're calculating what that risk is, we do have to put in some assumptions. And so one of those assumptions is that reduction factor from soil gas to indoor air. But we also have a lot of site-specific data. So there's a site-specific attenuation factor that's also used in those calculations. So we're looking at a number of factors that take both data-driven and then this very health protective number as well. So again, why am I telling you all of this? It's because I want you to understand how we're using all of this data that's being collected and that it is being analyzed in a health protective way for our risk evaluations. And that's because our risk evaluations is what determines the cleanup path forward. So, one last thing before I jump into what I know everyone wants to hear about, which is the cleanup part. But I do want to mention that we have our semi-annual monitoring reports. As data gets collected, every 6 months, a report is submitted to us with all of that monitoring data. And it's all that monitoring data that does also go into our risk evaluations. Now, I mentioned when the investigation began, we were evaluating the data compared to the 2016 screening level. And I also mentioned we were going to look at and see if we needed to reevaluate it to the 2019 screening levels. So something that's going to change is we're going to have, the Water Board has asked Ford to add the 2019 screening level to the figure. So we see all these figures up here, and there's little lines. That's the 2016 screening level, kind of showing where that boundary is for the concentrations. So they're going to add a line to it. It's going to look like the plume got bigger. It did not. And I have that as a bullet point because I want to reinforce that the plume is not growing. What we have really seen with all the trend graphs is that the plume is getting smaller on the outer edges and stuff, but we need that line so that we can do this additional data evaluation. So that's going to get added to the next semi-annual monitoring report. So the second semi-annual 2024 monitoring report, it'll be out in February of next year. And so I know a lot of questions is, how is this going to impact you? For some folks, it's not going to impact you at all because some of these areas, with the plume reducing, they were in the indoor air investigation, have been evaluated, but now they fall in between kind of these two screening levels. So we're gonna look at that. Some homes are gonna be brought into it, but we're not gonna just do a jump straight into indoor air monitoring like we did at the beginning of this investigation, because now we have a lot of information, a lot of data has been collected, so we can use multiple lines of evidence to support those next steps. So this could be looking at the soil gas data and seeing what those trends are doing, how it's decreasing, and it may also mean doing some additional indoor air sampling. But I know I've kind of thrown a newer item that we had discussed a while back. I'm bringing it back up. It's a lot of info, so please write down those questions. I'm not going into all the details because that could take up the rest of this meeting. And I know we want to get into this part, which is addressing the contamination. So we have two main ways that the contamination is being addressed. It's mitigation and remediation. So mitigation is that engineered exposure control that decreases the amount of vapor entry into a building, or it can address the vapors that have accumulated in a building. Mitigation is not a cleanup technology. It is to do just as it says, to address and kind of either prevent the vapors from going in or treat the vapors that have entered. What we do for cleanup is that remediation. So that's the removal action of that underlying source. And remediation can be either passive or active. And I'm going to go into all of this in more detail in the coming slides, but just want to pointed out what some of these things are. So your passive remediation, that's monitored natural attenuation. Some of the active remediation for this site is going to be soil vapor extraction, and it can be in situ groundwater remediation. So I want to start on the mitigation. For Bay Ridge Park, that particular community has some subslab depressurization systems. That's what SSD means, subslab depressurization systems. And that is preventing vapors from getting into the homes. This community is where we have had the highest amount of vapor intrusion occurring, and that's why they've been offered the SSD systems. It consists of piping that runs under a home and a fan that just redirects those vapors to above the roof line, and those vapors are treated as well. And what it does is it creates a pressure difference from below the foundation to inside the home so that those vapors don't enter the home. And so this photo on the right is what the SSD system looks like when it's all completed and they've got the enclosure to allow it to blend in with the building. 14 of these SSD systems have been installed. They are currently operating as of November of last year. They all replace the air purifying units that were in these homes. And we know that they're effective because indoor air sampling was conducted and it showed and confirmed its effectiveness. The photo on the right just shows what that SSD system looks like without the enclosure. So one of the things that I do want to mention that's kind of new with the SSD systems is there is ongoing monitoring to make sure it's working as intended. It's not a install and walk away kind of thing. So the water board needs to see that continued monitoring to confirm effectiveness. Now, a new thing that we observed the beginning of this year was that concentrations at 5 and 15 feet below the ground surface have been reducing ever since these SSD systems went in within Bay Ridge Park. And as the regulator, this is exciting to me because this supports that we don't have some mystery contamination that hasn't been previously identified. If there was some contamination as that vapor had a kind of exit route with these SSD systems, that source would off-gas and fill its space. And so we wouldn't be seeing this reduction. And so this really just kind of reinforces that the soil vapor extraction systems that just got turned on, and we're going to talk about that in a couple slides, are going to achieve the cleanup goals efficiently and should reach that in the expected timeframes that we've discussed in the past. All right, so now on to cleanup. I first mentioned passive remediation, that monitored natural attenuation. That's the remediation that just relies on naturally occurring reduction of contamination. For areas of the soil gas plume that don't warrant active remediation for like soil vapor extraction, this is the proposed approach. But because we're relying on that naturally occurring reduction, it has to be verified. So this is the preferred approach for areas of lower concentrations, but Ford can't just say, we're gonna do monitored natural attenuation and then walk away. Again, it has to be monitored. We have to make sure it is doing what they're saying it's gonna do, because contamination does need to go away. We can't just leave it in place. So this designated areas for M&A for the soil gas is highlighted in yellow. For groundwater, those areas are highlighted in yellow on this slide. Same kind of deal. It has to be monitored routinely to verify that that reduction is occurring. And again, it is for places that don't warrant the active groundwater cleanup. So for the monitored natural attenuation, the first half of the year, 4 new groundwater monitoring wells were installed. When a groundwater well gets installed, there's the big drill rig that comes to install it. When they are first installed, these wells, groundwater samples are collected 4 times that first year, and then they move to 2 times a year. For the soil gas monitoring, that monitoring occurs somewhere between 2 and 3 times a year. And then I just wanted to show what the well looks like when the drill rig goes away, once the well is set. So this photo on the left, that is the surface completion. It's a traffic rated well, it's bolted down. And then inside the photo on the right, you see this little red cap. That's the cap that goes into the 2-inch PVC pipe that has been installed vertically into the ground to a really specific depth to monitor groundwater. And so when samples aren't being collected, it is all secured to both protect pedestrians, vehicles, but also we don't want any contamination from surface runoff to get into these wells, which is why there's the well cap, and these well lids are bolted. So now the soil vapor extraction systems. The 2 areas where these have been installed is Bay Ridge Park and Belcourt Terrace. They're highlighted in yellow here. But I'm gonna zoom into these 2 communities a little bit more. Startup of these systems was July 26th, so just a month ago. This is a huge milestone, and I'm gonna probably say it a couple more times throughout this presentation because it took a long time to get it installed. So this is a big thing. Just getting through the obstacle of being able to power these systems was a hurdle. And so this is exciting. So these 2 maps, what they show is, I will say kind of right here in the center really is Country Club Drive. This is for Bay Ridge Park, the eastern half of it. For Belcourt Terrace, this is the western half and southern half of the community. Those lines is the piping that runs underground that is connected to each of those wells, and the wells are the little circles on the maps here where they're connected. They have a vacuum. They pull the vapors from below the ground. They go to a treatment building where the vapors are treated before being released to the atmosphere. And so I'm going to show you some photos because these systems are they're really great systems, the way they were designed. So one of the big things, they're right next to folks' homes. So noise level is a huge requirement and concern. It's required by the city to meet decibel levels. So one of the things that they did as part of the startup activities was verifying noise levels both during the day and at night. You'll see in these photos, the one on the left and the one on the top right, these curtains, those are sound blankets. They make a difference. I will say I've been at the site from when the doors are open, it's loud, you can hear it. When the doors close and the sound blankets aren't down, you can hear it, it's not as much because the building itself has soundproofing in it. But when these blankets are down, that system is incredibly quiet. And having seen a lot of just remediation systems, that's the most quiet I've seen one. So it's doing its job. This photo on the bottom is what it looks like, and this is a couple weeks old. I've been told the landscaping is complete, and so that was some of the final steps for Bay Ridge Park, was just finishing the landscaping exterior design elements. For Belcourt Terrace, same thing. As part of the system startup activities, verifying the noise level both during the day and at night have been done. So the photo on the bottom just shows what it looks like inside this treatment building. I know I've heard WSP say if anyone is interested in what it looks like and they're doing their monitoring, they're happy to show you what it looks like from at least the outside. You can't go in because of safety reasons, but if somebody's there, I know they're happy to answer questions. And then the top picture, this is not the final look. There were some exterior design element changes from that original rendering once the building was put in place. And so those exterior design elements are in the works right now, and that includes the siding, but then also the landscaping. And then just wanted to throw up the original renderings. Again, for the Belcourt Terrace, there was a little bit of a design shift that's gone through the HOA, but they're working on it now, and so that should be completed in about a month. And Bay Ridge Park is completed, correct, Mike? Yep. All right. So there are 2 areas where the groundwater cleanup portion, we're still in this, we need a little bit more information before we fully decide the path forward for groundwater. So that is in the works. There is active investigation in the southern area. For the northern area, we're in this section. A feasibility study and remedial action plan was submitted for our review, so that is in my queue to look at. But in past meetings, we had the big circle on the remedy implementation. For Bay Ridge Park and Belcourt Terrace, I decided now that these systems are up and running, we can, it's in that maintain and monitor the remedy. So this is a, again, huge milestone. Folks who have been here the whole time, I know, are excited that these systems are up and running because it's going to get us one step closer to the site getting fully cleaned up. Okay, so what's next? Every time I talk about monitoring, and I talk about monitoring, whether it's soil gas, groundwater, indoor air, all of this. It's important because especially as these cleanup remedies are in place, we have to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. We're dealing with below the ground, and there are unique geological features that we can't always see. And so sometimes contamination can be missed. From the data that we have collected, it is not apparent that any contamination has been missed. Because any opportunity, I have sat and scoured and looked and waited to find that almost aha. There was something that was missed from the cleanup back in the 90s. We haven't seen it yet, but again, this is why we're doing all the monitoring and requiring that of Ford. And if something changes, we know to course correct. We know to look a little more and stuff, but right now we're not seeing it, and everything is staying really consistent with the information we've had earlier on. Another part is that risk evaluation. As new data becomes available, whether folks are joining the indoor air investigation or some of that longer term indoor air monitoring, something changes, that can get compiled in these risk assessment reports, in these addendums. And so that just ensures that the path forward for the site remains health protective. And then remediation. So we're in this remedy implementation phase, and there will be, that's going to be ongoing for about a year, at least for the soil vapor extraction systems. Those are operating, they're being monitored and maintained. And again, that's the exciting part. So we have this summary slide. I'm not going to read it to you. This is the early on kind of first 5 years of the project, but it's for your reference. It's in your handouts. Definitely look at it. It's good information, good summary. What I want to touch on is kind of what's happened over the last year, because there's been a lot of movement with getting things in that cleanup, with the 2 big ones. The subslab depressurization systems being installed in Bay Ridge Park. Those are operating, they're being monitored and maintained, and then the soil vapor extraction systems being constructed and now operating. So our next steps really is the continued operation of the subslab depressurization systems and the soil vapor extraction systems, the ongoing monitoring of soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air, just to make sure we understand the impacts, and it supports any updates to the human health risk assessments, and then continued communication. So what that's going to look like is a lot of you out there, I know, look at these reports as they come in, but you're not environmental geologists or scientists and stuff. And so it can be a little challenging to decipher sometimes. Plus, these reports are really, really large with all of the analytical data. So something that we've also asked for to do moving forward now is including a plain language executive summary. It's going to summarize the report in a one-pager that can let you know what's going on. You can get kind of the general overview from that one page. It can also help facilitate if you do want to do that deeper dive into the report and what all this information means. So that's going to be for the quarterly remediation progress reports and then for the semi-annual monitoring reports. Then we're going to continue with those 2 times a year in those semi-annual community fact sheet updates. We will continue to hold community-specific meetings and do any kind of community-specific communications. Those are going to be ongoing and as needed. Those ones primarily have been to Bay Ridge Park and Belcourt Terrace because of all of the construction activities and the soil vapor extraction systems operating and those SSD systems. But if it's warranted for other communities, that will happen. And then conduct annual community meetings like this one. So if you want more information, GeoTracker, that's the state's database where all of the analytical data, all of the reports, our correspondences all go up there. This QR code that is on this slide will take you to the GeoTracker webpage. There's also GovDelivery. It's formerly known as the LIRIS list. That is the Water Board's email subscription where we typically use it to send out notifications of the next community meeting. The Water Board also has a web page specific to this project on the Santa Ana Water Board's website. And then Ford developed at the beginning of this project a site-specific website as well as an 800 number that you can call with any kind of questions. And then there is the local information repository at the library just down the way. So now we can do questions. I tried to blaze through it, and I know I went really quick, but there was a lot of information. So let's get the questions.
All right, thank you. Okay, just a real quick refresher for those of us that are new here. This is both an in-person and virtual meeting. Marcos and John in the back are running the virtual portion of it. Sarah's here to help tonight with the questions. We do want to make this meeting as informative and fruitful for all attendees. So just a couple things. Again, if you got your cards, please write your questions on those, and Sarah will pick those up, and I'm going to read them so the virtual attendees can hear. I know a lot of people like to come to public meetings to actually speak, so if you're one of those people, we will save time after we read the cards for you to actually talk into the microphone. I'm going to hold the microphone tonight while you're doing that because I think a lot of times people will start asking question after question after question and they go too quickly, so I'm going to try to slow us down tonight again so our virtual listeners have a better experience. Also, just as a reminder, property-specific questions we're going to take offline after the meeting. Number one, because we want to respect property owners' privacy. Number two, because we want to respect all attendees' time tonight. So we save time after the meeting. We have the maps here where we can go and look at your individual property and talk to your specific needs. If you're online and would like to have a property-specific question, put your number in the chat box and we'll call you tomorrow to set up an appointment. Also, if you're online and you have a question, please just type that question into the chat box and we will read that out at the, I'll read that out at the podium and have one of our panelists answer that. So I think that takes, is that all clear to everybody? And everybody can hear me, correct? Okay, good.
Will you add that also if they...
You go ahead, Ned. You can talk.
Was it on? Oh, I turned it off. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll add, because I know, Tracy, you were saying for those that want to have the like one-on-one calls and stuff, you mentioned WSP. That applies to me too. I just won't be working tomorrow, but I can get back to you next week. So, closer? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's perfect.
I'm just not used to talking to this thing so much.
Right, and I also want to call out that I saw a couple of people taking pictures of the QR code. It's on here. It's also, all this information is in your fact sheet all of the resources that you can go to get information. So if
And
you
I
didn't
checked,
get this
it works.
package, pick it up on the way out or raise your hand and Sarah will get it. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with people that wrote their questions because that's the preferred way. So does anybody have any questions that they've written that they would like us to read out? Oh. Right, okay, thank you. Please write legibly, or I might make up the question. That's what we don't want. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. The explanations for soil contamination and mitigation and remediation are very clear. Can you please bring more info on groundwater contamination, level, remediation, and what is the relationship between contamination of groundwater and soil?
Yeah, so I'll touch on that. It's just when we talk about groundwater, we're not talking about drinking water. So I'll say that one first. Depending on where you're at within the indoor air or within the investigation area that's outlined on the figures, groundwater can be anywhere from 55 feet below the ground surface to, I think we've seen it as shallow as 15 or 10. And so then another component is that impacted groundwater can go deeper than that first encountered groundwater. So as the regulatory agency, we want to look at the lateral distribution of that contaminated groundwater, as well as the vertical distribution. So how deep does it go? How wide does it go? So for the most part, that has been fully assessed and addressed. There's some fine tuning, if you would, in certain areas to get a little more information to verify is monitored natural attenuation the best fit. I will say in that southern area, there's more data collection going on. That way, the cleanup efforts that are proposed at a later date can be appropriate, efficient, quick. We don't want to rush into cleanup because what we have learned as an industry is when assessment gets cut short and isn't detailed enough, contamination tends to get missed. And what happens is, as part of that monitoring, when the remediation is complete, we're doing this rebound monitoring and we see concentrations go back up to where they were, sometimes to the same level of pre-cleanup. And so then you have to almost go right back to the drawing board. So we like to get all of that data and almost over-collect, just shy of over-collecting, ahead of the time so that way cleanup is effective. Now, one of the things and why that contaminated groundwater is important, one, we want to protect our drinking water resources and the beneficial uses of groundwater, even though there's not a drinking water well currently here. And because of the closeness to the ocean and stuff and the geological formations, it's not likely to be provide the right yield. It's still important to clean it up. Policies that are established in California require that. Second, that shallow first encountered groundwater, when it's contaminated, that can be a source of where that off-gassing, that dissolved contamination can be off-gassing and being that source of the soil vapor plume that is below the ground. So this is why we look at everything. Our presentations have primarily focused on the soil vapor and indoor air, that vapor intrusion component, because that's what is more directly impacting all of you that are here tonight, where there's more of that kind of in your face, I guess, approach. And so that's where we may not talk as much on groundwater, but it's still being, just because we're not talking about it, we're actively requiring Ford to investigate and evaluate that data. And I hope that answered all of your question. Correct.
I'm going to repeat that question.
Oh,
No, it's okay. It's all right. We're just trying to do a little bit better tonight. So I think it was basic. You repeat.
I'll just repeat it. It was that. So there's no current groundwater cleanup right now. No. Yeah. The areas. Most of these areas, the concentrations are low enough that the cleanup, active cleanup isn't warranted, and that's why it's that monitored natural attenuation. We've, over the years, seen those concentrations decreasing. But from some of the groundwater concentrations from some of the recent assessments, there is the likelihood of the need to do some additional active cleanup, but that'll be probably planned in the next year or two, but that'll be separate from the soil vapor intrusion work.
Right. Mm-hmm. And again, there'll be fact sheets coming out on that, and we'll have a meeting as well. Okay. Have you done an initial evaluation of the vapor extraction system since the July 26 activation? And if so, what did you find?
Yeah, so we are in what we're calling the performance monitoring stage. So the systems have been running 24/7 since August 7th. We do collect samples. For the first 2 weeks, we collected samples every day with a handheld instrument that measured both the influent and effluent concentrations, so what's coming into the treatment system and what's leaving the treatment system. We also collected lab samples that are sent off to an accredited lab to be analyzed. We have not received the data back from those, but from what we've seen from the handheld instruments, the influent concentrations have met the criteria that we are to require through AQMD, Air Quality Management District, because the system is designed to only treat so much contamination. So we've met those standards, and the effluent standards that we've seen with the handheld device known as a PID or an FID are orders of magnitude lower than the requirements, even non-detect in some cases. Now, when we get the analytical data, we will validate that data, and it will be part of our performance monitoring, and that will be published in what we're referring to as our quarterly OM&M, operation and maintenance and monitoring plans, and that'll be publicly available.
And that's also what's going to have that plain language summary at the beginning, because I know when it comes to the cleanup, everyone's interested in how is it doing? How are these systems performing? And we all want to know that, and so that's why we're going to ensure that there's that plain language summary.
And if I can just add to that, starting at the end of September, we will start collecting samples from those soil gas probes in those neighborhoods so that we can start to plot data to show a decreasing trend. I mean, that's what everybody wants to see, right? They want to see the concentrations decreasing in all of the probes. And so we're going to take our first data point collection in the end of September. And so that is also going to be publicly available in those quarterly reports.
Will you send those to us?
She asked if we would send them.
it.
And so
Good.
that I know from our past conversations, in those monthly email updates for Bay Ridge Park residents, there is going to be a brief little summary on that. It's something, we've asked for to do and discussed.
Yeah, excellent point. For the communities where the SVE systems are, you'll be getting more information or distilled information more up to date that's pulled out of those particular quarterly reports. And happy to have on-site meeting with you all to go through it and show the effectiveness of the system.
And I guess I would just ask, is there interest in that, having an on-site meeting to show the results? Okay. All right. Well, noted. Thank you. Okay. This question makes me laugh. This is 2024. Based on what you know today, when do you estimate you will leave?
I'm never going away. No.
It's a real question, though. When do you think that this will be done?
So this is really hard. Like when it comes to the soil vapor extraction systems, that is going to be short-lived. That is going to address these two communities, and we know for Bay Ridge Park, that treatment building has to be out max 2 years, like absolutely gone because of the permitting requirements and the special consideration. So we know that treatment system is out in 2 years. From data that I have seen and what we also saw from just the original cleanup activities within the One Ford Road community when the facility first shut down and cleanup activities occurred, I don't have any reason to believe that the cleanup won't be effective and long-lasting and permanent, that there's some kind of surprise source. We're just not seeing it in the data that's been collected. And there's a lot of lines of evidence, analytical data lines of evidence to support that. So that part will be done quicker. When it comes to some of the groundwater cleanup, that's going to be a few years down the road. And then once all active cleanup activities are done, then there is this post-remediation monitoring phase. And so regulators tend to not give timeframes on that because it's really hard, because there's so many obstacles and nuances with this. And for a site this size, we're really kind of taking it piece by piece, community by community, but also at the same time, looking at it as a whole. So we're around for a little bit, but cleanup activities are moving in the right direction, and the active remediation will be done, I would like to say in the next, handful of years, but soil vapor extraction, that'll be done in the next couple of years. Groundwater will be the next step.
Oh, here.
I can't give I know, I was just asked, what year are we leaving? I can't give a year, but we want to make sure the cleanup is complete, and that when we close the site, we don't reopen it down the road. Because what has happened sometimes back in the day, sites were closed based on kind of the knowledge at the time, and now we've really grown. We know a lot of information and how especially these particular contaminants behave. And so with all of the information we know, when the site closes, we don't want it to ever reopen again. We want that closure and be done. But timeframes, we just can't give. I'd like to, I just don't know.
Okay, thank you. And then this says, let me get to it, it's about slide 25, so one moment, please. Okay. On slide 25, regarding groundwater remediation activities, the southern yellow oval appears to indicate Belcourt Hill. Mm-hmm. However, that community isn't mentioned in the following chart. What is the remediation status in Belcourt Hill?
So that is that kind of area to be determined. That's where there's been in the last couple years a lot of groundwater samples being collected, and some new groundwater monitoring wells have been installed and they're being monitored. We need to evaluate those concentrations before and fully understand the lateral extent, the vertical extent, and before we can determine a cleanup path forward. So that's in the works, and it's continuing.
Okay. John, do we have any online questions? No. We don't. Okay, great. And then Sarah, any other questions? Anybody else? Wave your card. Okay, then I think I'm going to go ahead and take people that would actually like to talk into the microphone. Again, I'm going to, and I do see you. Thank you. Just give me a moment, please. I am going to hold the microphone again just because I don't want people asking a flood of questions. I want to kind of control the cadence of speech so that we can make sure everybody can participate. So I know the gentleman in the back has a question, and then anybody else, would you like to raise your hand, and I'm going to number you off. So the gentleman in the back first, and then you have two. And please remember your number because we all know I never do. So other folks? Okay, 3. Okay, then we're going to start with, I'll bring the microphone. Okay.
One of the most recent issues of the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, a very well-respected journal, Ray Dorsey, a neurology professor, zeroed in on what's happening right here. And I'm just curious if you guys can address this. He said, and I quote, "In Newport Beach, California, probes have measured TCE concentrations well over 100 times the state residential limit." And then he said a lot of other things in this story that was reported in the LA Times. Can you comment on that? And then I had 2 other really quick questions.
Yeah. So I'm going to let Amanda touch on just like the Parkinson's TCE connection, because I'm a geologist, but he has reached out. His passion is ending Parkinson's and is looking at and has hypothesized the theory between TCE and Parkinson's. And he when he went to high school here in Newport. And so that's why he kind of just looked it up, and this site popped up. They're hypothesized, and from my discussions with him, he has not said that he has seen any connections, but I'll let Amanda touch on just any of that health risks and what she has seen with some of the latest research papers.
Sure. And just to touch on, he said that.
I just want you to introduce yourself again and the
Okay.
agency you're from.
Hi. So my name's Amanda, and I'm a toxicologist that works for California Environmental Protection Agency. So I can talk about the Parkinson's study, but there was an implication that people are being exposed to really high levels, and I kind of want to address that. I think he's comparing a standard we have for indoor air, what people are exposed to what's being measured in the ground, and people aren't breathing the air in the ground. So that's not a fair comparison. What's been measured in people's homes are pretty low levels. They're on the order of they're close to the screening levels, which are set at a cancer risk, a chance of increased cancer risk of 1 in a million. Sometimes levels are slightly above that, but I don't think they get above one chance in 100,000. So these are pretty low levels. The associated health risks associated with the exposures are very low. In regards to Parkinson's specifically, there was a 2012 study looking at whether certain solvents might be associated with Parkinson's. And it did show a good association between the Parkinson's disease and TCE exposure. It's not conclusive evidence, though, that TCE causes Parkinson's. There just hasn't been that much study on it. So the study was in twins, and that makes it like a pretty strong study because they're, genetic similarities. The one twin had Parkinson's, the other twin didn't, and they looked at exposures in that person's past. There's always issues with those studies because it's based on what do people recall that they did in their past, what were their jobs, and you have to make assumptions about what the exposures were. There's also a limited number of people in that study. There also is some evidence in animals that TCE can cause effects similar to chemicals that cause Parkinson's. But yeah, just in general, it's not as much information in comparison. TCE is more well known to cause kidney cancer, and there's just a lot more information on that from people who've worked in the industry. It's just, there hasn't been that much study on it.
I was just going to say, I think people should read that article themselves and make up their own conclusion, because what I quoted was only a fraction of the evidence. You should also read the articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, and Lancet. It sounded to me like you were trying to cast doubt on this, saying it was 1 in a million, and somebody said, well, he just happened to go to Newport. He didn't do it because he went to Newport. He did it because it's the largest problem in California. So I just think people should really educate themselves about this. Secondly, are you working with Newport Christian School right across the street where children go to school?
So that one, that's the Christian school right on the north side of Bison, correct?
It's literally behind Bison, so it's on Bison.
Okay, yeah, so that one, early on in the investigation, that was exactly part of our, whenever we do assessments, we always want to look at what are the sensitive receptors. So that would be schools, elder care facilities, daycares, hospitals, and such. And even drinking water wells, where are those located? Where are the surface waters? Things like this. And we make an extra concentrated effort because they are sensitive receptors. So early on, there were a number of soil vapor probes that were placed on that property just to be extra vigilant of the fact that there is this school there. And over over the investigation, the soil gas probes that were around the school building itself were always not, had no reporting limits. If I recall that data, it was a while back. And the school had since asked that the probes be removed for they had done some work.
Construction activity.
Yeah.
We removed one probe.
Okay, and so they get routinely monitored, because again, we're dealing with below the ground, so we have that understanding of how the plume is behaving and all of that, but that comes with routine monitoring. So even when we have soil vapor probes that are not having any detections of the contaminants above the laboratory reporting limits, and those reporting limits are below the environmental screening levels for residential. So they are low enough and sensitive enough to make sure they're still protective. We don't have a reporting limit that's 10 times or 100 times over.
No.
Yeah, there's no risk to that school.
I
Yeah.
think you guys should go there like I did with a measuring device, and I went there with an independent consultant and see exactly how many feet they are from areas that you're saying are highly contaminated. Somebody really needs to look at that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I remember it.
All right, Danielle from Bay Ridge. So my question on the 14 SSD systems that did get installed, what's the time frame on those? And then what after that?
Yeah, so the timeframes, I am hesitant to give a time frame, because one of the things that we have seen with these subslab depressurization systems is that those 14 systems, they're per unit, but they're within and kind of spread across these 8 buildings. And what we've noticed is in the center of those 8 buildings, the soil gas concentrations at 5 and 15 feet have significantly reduced. The first time I saw this, I honestly was taken a little aback and just went, okay, is this a one-off? And I had asked Ford and WSP to bump up a sampling event before the SVE systems went on, because I wanted to see, was this just some anomalous data, or is the SSD systems actually causing the soil gas concentrations below the ground to reduce? Because all these buildings have kind of capped the soil vapor plume. And so by having these SSD systems, it's giving it an escape route, if you will. And so that's really promising. And time frame, we would like to keep it in place just to verify while the SVE system is operating, and even during that rebound monitoring. Eventually, they'll go off. But we just want to make sure we have the right monitoring data before they're fully removed. And I know.
So I mentioned the performance monitoring that we'll be doing as part of the SVE. Part of that will be the performance monitoring of the SVE system on properties that have SSD systems. So we're going to go through a process starting in September where we'll actually turn off the SSD systems for about 24 hours, and then we'll monitor the effectiveness of the SVE systems on those particular properties, then turn those back on. So it'll be an ongoing process to determine when we can turn those off. But it is something that we'll do as part of our performance monitoring, and it'll be reported quarterly.
Similar question to that was the people that did choose to have that tested, the air quality tested, did everyone opt in to have that installed? Because I feel like 14 is a low number.
No, they didn't. There was 22 properties that were offered SSD systems, and of those, 14 decided to participate. But I will say, if you are one of those that did not want to participate and still want to, please reach out to us.
And I would also add that that's at no cost to you. The installation, the removal, the operation. Okay, there was somebody else, but thank you. I'm going to hold it.
Oh, okay, yeah, right. Okay. So if you, no problem. If you get tested one day, you have the canisters in one day and it shows non-detectable. Can something change within, let's say, a month or 2 months? I know we get tested every 6 months at where I am. Could something drastically change in a couple of months? Maybe there's a rain and, soil erosion or anything like that, or, yeah, that was one question.
I mean, really, no, I will add, like, with the rain, when it rains with irrigation, that soil moisture takes up the pore space. And so what we've seen is it can reduce or even hinder vapor intrusion in some areas. Because we're looking at really long-term health effects, if there's a change, it's not going to have this immediate threat. These concentrations are really low. And so that's why the 6-month sampling, we want to capture that seasonal variability when those both natural and man-made factors may be most influenced, and we can really collect that most conservative sample. Ideally, if it was commercial buildings, we want to see it with the HVAC systems off. We don't do that because it's your homes. And if it's summertime, you don't want to be in a stuffy house for 24 hours and all of that, and we fully understand that. And so really all the sampling has been, how do you live in your home? But we do try to, the indoor air sampling is intended to be targeted during conservative times, so the weather extremes.
Just to add to that, to kind of piggyback on your question about changing conditions, the soil gas probes that are beneath the garage in your particular HOA and outside of your garage, the ones that are correlated to the indoor air sampling that we use to see if there's a vapor intrusion source, those are sampled 3 times a year. So if something were to change in those, that could dictate whether or not we sample your property more frequently. At your particular HOA, we don't see increasing trends with those particular probes, but we do watch those 3 times a year, and Jessica looks at them as well to determine whether a modification to your sampling schedule needs to be taken.
One thing just came up too is like if, there was an earthquake or something, I mean, that would, things move, right? And then one question just for Amanda is, do you know, you may not know the answer to this question, but how much would you have to breathe on a regular basis? Let's say there was a breach and, how much would you have to be breathing? Yeah, the exposure or whatever. Yeah.
For what to happen?
Well, to have some negative health effects besides just sneezing.
So most of the effects we're looking at, because the concentrations are low, what we're looking at are these long-term health effects. And so the assumptions that were made that go into the screening levels, which is our protective threshold that we don't want to go over, the ESLs that Jessica's comparing concentrations to, they're based on exposures for 26 years, for 24 hours a day, for a home. So I don't want to say you have to be exposed necessarily that long to have a health effect, but for a lot of these chronic effects like cancer, that was the assumption that went into the threshold that we're comparing concentrations to. TCE is unique in that it can have an effect in a shorter time frame, and that's outlined in the fact sheet about a heart defect to a baby if a woman is pregnant. So that would be one possibility that could happen in a shorter time frame, but otherwise what we're looking at is long-term, years of exposure to cause the health effects.
And Amanda, I just want to clarify one thing. When you say 24 hours a day, is it 365 days a year as well? So 24 hours.
Well, it's 350 days a year, but yes, close.
Okay, so
Yeah.
most of a year as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You want me to touch on the earthquake part?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because that's a big one. Like, we have earthquakes, and that's something there's a lot of, Amanda's a part of this group, but Cal EPA has a vapor intrusion work group. And I know one of our members, we're all concerned about what happens if there's an earthquake and it compromises the foundation. One of the members' husbands is a structural engineer or something, and his whole comment is, if there's an earthquake that's going to damage your foundation, it's going to cause cracks in your walls as well, and that's going to increase your ventilation. So actually an earthquake will help. Is that the case? I don't know. but this is why we're still monitoring. And so if there's that big shift, we're going to be out there routinely to check. And if there was that large, I say if, when we have the next big one, that there may be an uptick in the indoor air sampling that we're going to be asking Ford to do if the concentrations in soil vapor are the same as they are right now. Ideally, we want to get all the soil vapor concentrations to those levels where they're not that risk to human health now and in the future. So even if, I say when the earthquake hits, it's not a concern.
I have one more question here. Any other questions that we can answer? Okay. Hold on. What are the findings for homes on Cheshire Court in Belcourt? What are the findings for homes on Cheshire Court in Belcourt?
So that's that little, I'm going to say that's that little like knob that goes out, right? So the homes that have been sampled, their vapor intrusion has not been identified. There was early on a home that had an exceedance, and it wasn't apparent that it was from vapor intrusion from the subslab soil gas sample. But for the homes that have just the one subslab, as the regulatory agency, that's not good enough. And so when we see detections, we want some more information. So we were looking at and had asked Ford to collect samples, air samples from the sewer. Was the sewer acting as a conduit? And that happened in a number of locations. It is not. And that was that conclusion. Plus, we were looking at the surrounding soil gas probes that are at 5 and 15 feet. And what we've seen in that area is that the soil vapor plume has significantly reduced off of Cheshire Court as more data came available. Because there was that little lobe, it kind of did this right-hand turn over there. As the regulator, we're asking why. Is there some unknown groundwater? Like, does contaminated groundwater leave the plume in this direction? Or is this just the soil type is allowing the migration of the soil vapor plume in this one section? So some extra investigation did go into that area, and nothing was identified that said there's more. And again, we've been seeing decreasing concentrations in that area, and the plume has gotten closer back to kind of Belcourt Terrace and 1 Ford Road.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Well, then I think, and no questions online, John? Okay. So one more time, we will stay after and answer any kind of property-specific questions. Jessica is able to answer those. Mike is able to answer those. Heidi in the back is able to answer those. If you'd like to have your indoor air tested and you're eligible if you're in one of the areas, you can give your name to Sarah. Sarah, raise your hand, and she'll make sure that you get a call the next day. And on behalf of everybody here, particularly the Water Board, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We know there were other things you could do with your evening, so we truly appreciate your in-person attendance, and those online, you attending as well. And thank you also for adhering to the rules to slow down a little bit and make sure everybody was able to hear the questions. I think we all appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.